In this video, we will talk about the context of the Gospel of John. When we talk about the authorship of the Gospel of John, we talk about it just like we have the other Gospels. Traditionally, this is ascribed to John. Now, we do see several different Johns in the New Testament. First of these is John the Baptist. Now, John the Baptist was an early Jewish leader who had a huge following, but more than likely was not the author of this text, since he lived and was born before Jesus. We also see the figure John the Apostle, who is one of the disciples of Jesus and the son of Zebedee. This John is typically the one who is traditionally believed to be the author of the Gospel of John. Many refer to him as the beloved disciple, the disciple that we see throughout this text, who reclines on the breast of Jesus. What more than likely happens in the writing of this text is not that John the Apostle actually wrote it, but that it was written by some of his followers from the Johannine school. And this probably happened around 90 CE. Now, 90 CE is 20 to 30 years after the writing of the Gospel of Mark, more than likely. And this text probably went through several phases of editing. Some of the chapters were probably additions later, and there seem to be some discrepancies throughout, which again contribute to this idea that the Johannine school wrote it rather than one singular person. We see the chapter 21 in the book of John seems to be a bit different from the others and is believed to be a later edition. Some of the information that we see in this text seems to be things that are developed later in Christianity, not at the beginning of the movement like we see in the other synoptic gospels. When we talk about the beloved disciple, we see these images of the disciple who leans on the breast of Christ and is his favorite disciple, essentially. Now, the disciple that's talked about in this text, people often equate with John the Apostle, saying that he is the beloved disciple. But the text never claims that John actually wrote this gospel and does not connect John with the beloved disciple. Again, this is something that happens in early Christianity, but after the point of the Gospels. More than likely, the beloved disciple is either a follower of John the Apostle himself, and one of the disciples in the Johannine school, or possibly is an exemplar of believers in general. So, of the people following Christ, the beloved disciple could essentially be somebody that any Christian could put themselves in that place. The Gospel of John was more than likely written to a Jewish Christian audience. And this audience was probably located in Ephesus, which is believed to be where the Johannine school was. Now, the Jews in this area, these Jewish Christians, were facing persecution. This persecution was coming on three main fronts. One of these was Jewish persecution. They, of course, were experiencing persecution from the Romans, but this was because of the movement of Christianity as a whole. The Jews, however, were not letting the Jewish Christians worship in their synagogues. Jews were actually attacking the understanding of Jesus, claiming that he was a blasphemer and that his being raised from the dead was false. We also see followers of John the Baptist persecuting, in some ways, these Jewish Christians, saying that John the Baptist, rather than Jesus, was the Messiah that was predicted by the Hebrew Scriptures. And finally, we see some pushback of Docetism, which we will talk about here in a moment. Some of the intentions of the Gospel of John, then, are to explain to Jews and Christians how Jesus is actually divine, not simply human, and also encourage Jewish Christians to affirm their faith publicly. Again, they're being persecuted by other Jews, and not allowed to worship in the synagogue, so many of the Jews seem hesitant, these Jewish Christians seem hesitant to publicly affirm their faith, which is something that the gospel encourages them to do. It also argues against these false teachings. And as I mentioned, these are the Jews claiming that Jesus did not actually become the Messiah, was not raised from the dead, and that followers of John the Baptist believed John was the Messiah, not Jesus. Finally, the teachings of Docetism. So let's look at Docetism for a moment. Docetism is a belief in the movement of Gnosticism. Gnosticism comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge. The focus of this belief system is that there's one supreme God who had wisdom, and the wisdom was essentially stolen and hidden, and by Yahweh, a lesser God to the supreme God, which is the God that we see in the Hebrew Bible, was distributed into humanity. And all humanity has a divine spark. The purpose of Jesus, then, in this idea, is to find that divine spark within others and lead them to true wisdom. Now, Gnosticism is seemingly a part of this, and Docetism is a part of Gnosticism. It comes from the Greek word dokesis, which means illusion or apparition. Now, the teaching of Docetism was that Jesus' physical form was not actually real, but was rather an illusion. We can see from the word Docetism here. Now, this is something that John wants to argue against in his gospel. And one of the ways that we see this is in the very beginning of the gospel, where the writer says the Word was made flesh. This explains that while the Docetists argue that Jesus was not a physical human being, that he was made into flesh, regardless of whether he was divine or not. Let's look at a couple of themes that we see in the Gospel of John. The first of these is that Jesus is God. In the other Gospels, we've seen that Jesus is the Son of God, that Jesus is the Son of Man, but John is focused on showing that Jesus is in himself God. At the same time, the Gospel also wants to show that Jesus is very much human. And this is again something that's probably pushing back against the Docetists. There's also an argument that Jesus was pre-existent and became human after this pre-existence. In this gospel, discipleship is not equal to suffering, but is rather equal to public affirmation. To be a true disciple of Christ means to publicly affirm one's faith. Finally, we see the theme of the advocate. The advocate is essentially the Holy Spirit, and is what Jesus explains he is leaving behind when he ascends to heaven, for his followers to have to help them. We have a few distinguishing features that we only see in the Gospel of John. The first of these are a few figures, like Nicodemus, Doubting Thomas, and Lazarus. We also see the woman at the well, who Jesus asks to bring him water. And the woman is Samaritan, so she would not be friendly to Jews at this point. We also see the I am statements, where Jesus says, I am the Messiah, I am the bread of life, I am the light of the world, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and so on. Finally, we get the new commandment from Jesus. In the Hebrew Bible, there are many commandments, actually totaling 613. In the Gospel of John, Jesus gives a new commandment to his followers. He says in John 13, I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. By this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. Now that we've reached the end of this video, you should be able to explain the authorship, composition date, audience, and authorial intent of the Gospel, describe the historical setting and context of the Gospel, and identify the themes and distinguishing features in the Gospel, and give examples of how they are used in the text.